The way, like the science of how to work out if something was safe or not is called toxicology. And a really fundamental principle, like literally in the first couple pages of any toxicology textbook, is that safety depends on dose, like how much you get, the percentage of the ingredient in the product, how much you're applying. It also depends on how it interacts with other ingredients. So some ingredients like skin penetration enhancers, they can get things into your skin more easily. Other ones will keep those ingredients out. So all of this detail is not the case with these apps. These apps literally just scan the ingredient list, and based on the ingredient list, they rate every ingredient with a rating and then jam all of those together to give out a score.
This week, I'm coming to you past my bedtime because today's guest is all the way in Australia. But as I told her when I begged her to come on the show, she is the ultimate mic drop of a podcast guest. Dr. Michelle Wong, PhD, also known as LabMuffinBeautyScience, is a science educator and cosmetic chemist, and as her title suggests, a PhD. She was one of the very first science educators I ever followed on social media, and to this day, I still reference her YouTube and blog whenever I have questions on cosmetic science. She is as thorough can be, and she has a true dedication to evidence-based skincare. She was the OG when it came to myth busting in the skin space, so today that's exactly what we're going to do. Whether it's myths about hyaluronic acid, the EWG, why does the EU ban so many more ingredients than the US? DIY sunscreen, I can guarantee you are going to learn something in this episode that's going to shock you. Dr. Michelle Wong, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. When I started this podcast, you were one of my top of mind guests and one that the audience continues to request, and I know you're so busy, so truly thank you for taking the time to come on.
Thank you for having me.
I'm really excited to chat. So to start off the podcast, the first thing I like to ask my guests is, what is your first skincare memory?
Oh, that's a good question. I think my first skincare memory, if we think way back, it was probably like my grandma putting this really ancient like Chinese skin cream on me. I think like a little bit later, it was my dad buying me one of those like bright blue Avon scrubs with the really chunky, sharp particles. It was horrific. And I used it so much. And that was like, I guess, the start of the whole like pain is good sort of mentality in me.
So did you always know you wanted to get into skincare, or like how did your career, I mean, you're one of the most well-known chemists in this space. How did you get here? Is it something you always knew you were interested in, or did it take some time to figure out that you had a true passion for skincare and cosmeceuticals and ingredients?
Honestly, so when I was in high school, my parents were quite strict Asian parents, so I wasn't allowed to wear makeup. I wasn't allowed to get into skincare. And then when I went to uni, they were like, okay, you're allowed to do whatever you want now. And I just had no idea because I just never was into it. It's actually quite funny. When I was a kid, my mum would always tell me, you're not very pretty, but you're smart, and that's okay. And that's better because it's better to be smart. You'll lose your looks as you get older. So I never thought of myself as attractive, and I never thought of myself as like being able to do anything about my appearance. And then when I went to uni in a first year psychology lecture, I think it was a social psychology class, our lecturer said, well, if you faint and fall over in the street, people are more likely to help you if you're more attractive. And I was like, well, crap. My brains aren't going to do anything for me in that situation. I better put some of these points I have in like brains into making myself attractive enough to get an ambulance called for me. So yeah, that was kind of like the start of like me looking into skincare and looking into like makeup and stuff like that. Like before that, it was just like, if I had a pimple, I'd be like, how do I deal with this one pimple, and then go on with my life. But then I was like, actually, I'll start looking into this. And then the more I looked, the more it was really confusing. The more I realized like the information online at the time, which would have been like 2008, maybe 2006, somewhere there. It was just really bad. There just wasn't much online. I think the only person even trying to talk about the technicality behind skincare was Paula of Paula's Choice. And yeah, I started looking into it from there. And I was studying chemistry, and I did first year psychology, but I was studying chemistry and pharmacology at the time because I was fascinated by the idea that you could take a tablet and then it would somehow get rid of your headache. I was like, how did it know to get to your brain? Like now I realize it just goes everywhere, and it just so happens that your brain was in pain and It was one of the pains that it killed. But yeah, so I started going, how do these things that I put on my skin, how did they interact with my body? What are they actually doing? What does brightening mean? What does smoothing actually mean on a molecular level? So I guess that was like the start of my dive, and I have a terrible memory. So I was like, I need to write this down because I'm going to forget. And other people are probably also wondering, and they don't have the same resources as me to find this information.
Yeah, and I think you were probably the first chemist in the space that I ever followed. And I was immediately drawn to just your kind of like no BS approach. And it didn't matter. You were never taking a side, right? You were just on the side of science and trying to communicate that to the public, which I really just commend in the space that we're in currently, just the integrity that you have as a science communicator. And one of my favorite types of content that you do is myth busting. So I want to ask you a little bit about some of the most common myths, but first I want to hear, is there one currently that is like driving you crazy that you keep seeing that you want to bust for us? Maybe something that's just like always in the back of your brain, like, gosh, I wish people would stop saying this.
I think there isn't one that's like always in the back of my brain, but recently one that's been really annoying me is probably the idea that hyaluronic acid is bad. Just having that out there, it's just quite annoying. I feel like it's just been overly demonized.
I love that you mentioned that because I think that's one of those ingredients that is, it kind of had this heightened peak of popularity, and now we're like in this trough of it because I think so many experts are talking about it in more of a negative light. So what is your take on HA? I mean, it's in so many things. People often don't even realize they're already using it in a lot of their products along with other humectants, but what is your thought on it in general? Do you think it can be irritating in certain molecular weights or in certain, if you're using in too many products, or do you think generally it's not going to cause an issue for most skin types?
Well, like you said, I think a lot of people are already using it without realizing it. It's in things like generic tretinoin, like any sort of tretinoin product you get, there's probably hyaluronic acid in it. And it's clearly had lots of benefits. It's one of the most tested products that we use, right? Like it's a proper medication. I do think some people can be sensitive to it. I think like any other ingredient, some people are going to react to it. And I think the main reason people react to it though is because it is a really good skin penetration enhancer. So it's going to make things go through your skin better because it's so good at hydrating. And I think that's actually it. Like you're using it along with your other products. Maybe your other products were fine before. And then once you've added the hyaluronic acid, everything else is penetrating more, and that can lead to irritation. So I think that's probably going to explain a lot of it. There's also the sort of myth that it dries out your skin if you're not using it with water or if you're not using it in a humid climate. And that isn't true. I haven't seen any evidence that suggests that that is actually true. Like in theory, it could be true. But even in theory, it's not very strong. So the way that hyaluronic acid works, and any humectant really, it only works really short range. Water basically has to bump into it before the water can grab. So it's not like a magnet. I see a lot of people saying humectants are like magnets. Mm-hmm. They're really more like sticky tape. Like the water has to bump into it before it grabs onto it. And so we've got transepidermal water loss. We have water coming out of our skin all the time. And that's really the water that it's grabbing onto. It's not like pulling water out from deeper. It's water that was trying to leave your skin already, and it's almost like a sticky mesh on top of your skin, near the top of your skin. It's just grabbing onto that as it's trying to leave. So yeah, how it could possibly dry out skin is just not really that convincing, because deep down in our skin, we have about 70% water, like deep in our bodies, and then that decreases as we go up. And so it's almost like we have this never-ending ocean of water inside our bodies, and then this is just the little bits that are lapping at the beach. And so even if it was pulling water out, it's not really pulling very much. Like there's so much water left in us. It's really hard to dry out all the way inside.
And what about using it on damp skin? Does it need to be used on damp skin to be effective?
No. So if you have hyaluronic acid in a serum, if it's not like really thick and gloopy, like super thick and gloopy, unusably gloopy, then that hyaluronic acid is already saturated. Like it's sort of like a sponge. It's already holding too much water. If you add extra water, that extra water isn't going to do much. So you don't really need to use it on damp skin, but a lot of people do like using it on damp skin because it spreads nicely. It might feel a bit nicer. And I think hyaluronic acid does perhaps do this thing. And I got this is like a theory of Stephen, of Kind of Stephen. Mm-hmm. He's amazing. He's like one of the OG chemists.
I love him. Yes, he's great.
He's great. His idea is that maybe what hyaluronic acid is doing is it's forming a film on the top of your skin, almost like glue, like if you spread glue on your hand and you can peel it off, sort of like that. And so as it dries down, it tightens a little bit. And people might be interpreting that as dryness.
That makes sense. It's so many of the little things that you're saying is kind of a light bulb moment for me, especially what you just mentioned, and also why sometimes we can feel that HA might be irritating. It's something I hadn't thought of before, that it's just you're adding it into a routine with your other ingredients. So potentially those ingredients are now causing an issue where they wouldn't maybe have before. So I think when someone like you who truly understands the science of an ingredient, when you speak to it in that nature, it's like, oh, okay, that makes complete sense. It all kind of comes together full circle. So one other topic of yours that I love listening to you talk about, I reference your blog posts on this all the time when I get questions on it and send people there because you just do such a beautiful job of explaining it, is pore clogging ingredients. And we've seen over the years these pore checking websites, these ingredient checker lists that people can cross-check their product ingredient lists off of. And it's anytime I post about a product I like, they will say, does it contain potentially pore clogging ingredients? It's like this buzzword. So I would love to hear what your thoughts are on those lists and checklists. Are they helpful for somebody who feels like they tend to have skin that clogs easily?
I think they're pretty unhelpful unless you're starting from literally nowhere, which I think most people are not. So these pore clogging ingredient lists, these comodogenicity ratings. Yeah, so these ratings, they come from a lot of experiments, mostly on rabbit ears. So rabbits were used as a model for this. They would just rub the ingredient on the rabbit ears and then look for enlarged pores. They also come from some studies where they put the plain ingredient on someone's back and then usually covered it with a bandage and then looked again for enlarged pores. And usually those were men with oily skin because it's the easiest to see pores on them. So first off, that's not the same as your face skin. Your face skin won't clog as easily as in these experiments. Plus, these ingredients are mixed with lots of other ingredients in your skincare products. So there's a lot of differences between these tests and what happens on your skin. And on top of that, everyone has different skin chemistry. Like we have different balances of what ingredients we have on our skin, basically, what substances we naturally have, what's inside our sebum, for example. We have different mixes of fatty acids. We also have different sensitivities to the ingredients on our skin, like how much our pores clog depends so much on things like genetics, like your sort of innate propensity to get clogged pores, if that makes sense, how pore cloggy you are. So with all of these variables, like having a straight list is just not very helpful. So usually I think what is much more helpful is if you keep track of which products are clogging your skin, you keep maybe an Excel spreadsheet of them, and then you look at if there's any sort of ingredients in common between them. I guess you can look at these lists and use that as a starting point for looking for ingredients, but a lot of the time it's not going to match what's on the list. So I think those lists, I really don't like them because I've seen so many people see a post about these lists and then in the comments they'll be like, I've been using this product. It's been working really well for me. Should I stop using it? And it's like, no, you shouldn't stop using a product that is working literally on your skin really well, not clogging your pores, because it might have clogged the pores on a rabbit ear. That just makes no sense to me. It's such a waste of money. I was a PhD student. I was on a student budget for a long time. I just get so upset seeing people just wasting product. And also environmentally, it's just this product worked fine. Don't chuck it out. I see a lot of people chucking things out, with this and also with those clean ingredient apps, which I'm sure we'll get to. Just put it at the back of your cupboard. Please don't throw it out. It hurts me.
Yeah, no, I agree completely. And one other point that you mentioned in your content around this topic, which I always reiterate to people when I send them to it, is that even if there's none of those ingredients on the list of your product, it could still potentially clog your pores. So not only are you potentially looking at a list and saying, oh, there's an ingredient on a product I love, and then potentially tossing it out, but it could work the other way around where there could be none of the ingredients on that list and it could still potentially be a problem for you. Is that correct?
Yeah, exactly. Because a lot of people, if you're really acne prone, I used to be before I worked out what to do. Your skin just clogs. Like it clogs on its own. The stuff in your sebum is enough to clog it. You don't even need any extra products.
Yeah, I think it's hard because there's a lot of content being pushed around this, and I can see where it can be really overwhelming for people. And I always like to say as well, I from someone who has dealt with adult acne in my 20s, I understand how disheartening it can be, and you feel like if there's anything you could possibly do that's potentially in your control, you want to do it. So I understand why there's such an emotional tie to this type of content and these lists, but it's always good to hear the actual science behind it, so we're not unnecessarily throwing out our products or afraid of products that might work for us. And one other myth that I see actually a lot of dermatologists and other experts talk about is rosemary oil for hair loss. So I wanted to chat with you about that one because I know that the science is like iffy at best on this one.
Exactly, yeah. So there was this one 2015 study that a lot of people cite, and I think a lot of people only looked at the abstract. So this is one of the big problems with looking at scientific studies. A lot of the time, the abstract is sort of like the packaging. It's sort of like almost like those tiny one-line summaries of movies. Like you read it and it sounds great, and the movie could be terrible. Sometimes the description is terrible and the movie is great. Like it just doesn't tell you very much. You have to actually watch the movie. You have to read the study. And if you read the actual study, it's just so bad. There's so many little details that are just wrong. There's like mistakes. There's like, they say they use the Hamilton scale for depression when it should be the Norwood-Hamilton scale for hair loss. Like there's just so many little issues with it. I think any of the experts who are citing the study, I think if they actually looked at the study carefully, they would have realized how bad it is. And I haven't talked about this yet. It is in an upcoming video, but I think it's actually put out by a paper mill. So there's this huge problem in science, which is paper mills. And basically what these are like factories that are just pumping out low quality papers that are written by people who don't know what they're talking about. Like they're not experts in hair loss or pancreatic cancer or whatever other topic is at hand. It's just like a company that puts out crappy studies. A lot of the time they are faked. And the reason I think this is, first off, like the mistakes, like that Hamilton rating scale mistake, but also the final author on the study. He's published about, I think, 400 papers in a year, and that is like not a normal rate.
No.
So in science, usually you publish maybe 10 papers a year in a good year. So like he's publishing more than one study a day. Like that's an impossible output rate. So these factories, they put out studies, they charge authors to just stick their name on it, and then it goes out. And right now, there's a lot of scientific publishers who are trying to get rid of these studies. A whole bunch of them are doing like mass retractions. It's a really slow process though. So I think, yeah, that study just doesn't seem reliable. And there's not many other studies on rosemary oil. There's none on it alone on humans. There are some animal studies and cell studies, but those usually, I mean, most of the time they don't translate to humans, which is why we do tests on humans. Most drugs that work in mice do not work in humans. So yeah, the amount of evidence is really low. I mean, in theory, it could still work, but there's also a lot of science that it probably doesn't because there's all this like fakery around it. A lot of the animal studies are also really terrible. Like there's one where there's like duplicated images, which is another sign that someone is trying to cover something up. Yeah, so it could work, but essential oils we know are irritating, and we know that irritation also causes hair loss. A lot of the hair loss treatments are also irritating, but we know because of good studies that that irritation is worth it. Like overall, you end up with more hair. But yeah, I think it's gone really trending on social media. Some people do find that it, I guess, quotation mark, works. But I think a lot of the time what's happening is they are cleaning their scalp better. So they're using an oil, they're massaging it into their scalp. It's basically like an oil cleanser. So I think that could potentially work with less risky oils that aren't as irritating. So maybe just try sunflower oil perhaps and see if that works around the same before you start trying rosemary oil. And also some types of hair loss, they are progressive. So the longer you keep using ineffective treatments before you switch to something effective, the worse it gets, and it might not be able to reverse. So if you have hair loss that you can't explain, I highly recommend going to a dermatologist and asking for something that actually works.
I love that you mentioned that, because that is one of my biggest gripes with some of these trends in hair loss is, as you just mentioned, some of these progressive types become scarring, and then you can no longer grow hair from those follicles. And that's precious time that you're wasting. So I always recommend getting a proper diagnosis for treatment. I think something that also happens in the hair loss space is that one of the most common types of hair loss, TE, is a cycle. So naturally it gets better after a few months, and you're using something and then you're like, oh, my hair is growing back, it's getting better. And then you're putting, you're thinking that it's that ingredient or that vitamin or whatever else it might be. You think that's what's helping your hair, when in reality it would have gotten better on its own. And I think some of these companies sometimes use those kind of before and afters and rely on those to get their messaging across, when in reality that hair loss might have gotten better on its own. So it's really, really hard. And it's another one of those things that's so emotional, just like acne, where I understand people are kind of grasping at straws, doing whatever they can to try to help mitigate hair loss. But I also am seeing this trend back to talking about the study itself. I'm seeing this trend of more and more consumers trying to look to the research themselves. And I think a lot of that comes from mistrust of people on the internet, rightfully so, because there is so much misinformation. But they're trying to search PubMed, they're searching Google Scholar on their own. So what are some things that we can look for in a study? I know that this is really a whole college course on its own, but are there some little tips and tricks when evaluating a study? You already said looking beyond the abstract. Anything else we can do when we're trying to determine if there's validity in the data or the research that we're looking at?
Honestly, reading studies is really hard. And I do think most people probably shouldn't bother, because reading a study properly, officially, if you have a PhD, you are still only really qualified to assess papers in your exact field and maybe like a tiny bit on either side. And everyone with a PhD, we have very narrow fields of expertise. So for example, my PhD is in medicinal chemistry. I could probably only assess, without like doing a lot of background reading, some medicinal chemistry papers. I probably can't even look at all medicinal chemistry papers. If you gave me physical chemistry, I would have to read up on physical chemistry with my whole bachelor of chemistry for like a good half a day before I could even begin to understand that paper to any level of detail. So with that in mind, it is hard. Like, it's not going to be easy, but I do think there are some things that you can look for. So I guess my biggest tips, first off, when you're looking at papers, look around the paper. So see if there is already some sort of expert commentary on the paper. Get as much expert commentary as you can. So look up if someone has already talked about it, like a science communicator like me, for example, or other people. Don't just look at me as well. Like, don't just trust one source, even me, please. There's also a website called PubPeer where people can put out comments on particular papers, and I've started contributing to it, but there's not much there on cosmetic science, so maybe you'll get lucky. But there are some comments there from people who are used to looking at literature and looking for bad studies, because there are so many bad studies out there. There are things like paper mills that are just putting out trash content, like fake studies just to pump up people's CVs. Also for cosmetic science, it's not a very competitive field. Like, there's not a lot of people studying it, so there's not a lot of scrutiny. So there are a lot of really terrible studies, especially for cosmetic science out there. So in general, probably assume that studies are bad to begin with. I think that really helps. Other things to look at, I guess the easy things are things like sample size. If you have a really small sample, it's more likely to be an unreliable result. Also look for a control or comparison. So they're treating someone with a particular ingredient, and then they're also treating people without that ingredient. And so you can see whether or not that particular condition would have gotten better on its own to begin with. Also look for if that study is actually testing the ingredient in a way that's comparable to how you would be using it. So for example, there are studies where they might be just using that ingredient without any other ingredients. They might be just using it in a really simple product, like in water, for example. They might be microneedling that product into the skin. They might be delivering it with lasers. So that's not going to be the same as if you use it in a skincare cream, for example. But yeah, I think also don't expect a study to be quick to read. So even I probably, with any study, it will take me several days to read it. Like, I'll read it for a few hours on the first day. I'll probably get a little bit through it. I'll have to do a whole bunch of background reading to try to understand half of what I'm looking at. Also, in general, don't trust anything that's in any like sentences in the abstract, in the introduction, in the discussion, or the conclusion. Always verify everything in those, because those bits don't tend to be checked very hard during peer review. It's really the methods and the results that are important. But yeah, in general, it's really hard to read papers. I probably don't think it's worth reading papers for most people. Like, I would not even bother trying to read a paper that was not cosmetic science these days. Like, if it's something like, I don't know, supplements, like, I am not going to try to read that. It's not worth my time. I will find someone else who knows that field and ask them what they think.
I think one thing that's really important in this space, and you kind of already mentioned this, is just find a few experts. I agree, more than one, a handful of experts that you truly trust, and you trust their methods and you trust the way they approach the science, and take the advice from them rather than trying to do the research on your own, because it is so convoluted. And like you just mentioned, it takes you days to get through a paper, and you're someone who has the clinical or the scientific background to back it. So it's very difficult for the rest of us to critically assess these papers.
Yeah, like, I don't want to be like gatekeepy or like discouraging, but honestly, it is really hard. It is a skill that comes with practice. I've been practicing for like so long. I had a PhD when I started, and like even now I think back to like 2014 and I cringe at how I used to interpret papers.
Yeah, it is so fascinating, and things are changing all the time. And I had never even heard this notion of a paper mill until you just said that, and that's just so discouraging. But I mean, that it's also the way that medicine is going in a lot of ways, because there's this drive and this need to be published, and it sounds like that's kind of what's driving those paper mills. And they're profiting off of it, which is really, really sad.
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of it is, particularly in countries, there are particular countries where paper mills are more active, and it is usually because of incentive structures where it's like you need to publish to advance to the next stage in your career.
This episode is brought to you by, well, me. Skinthusiast.com is your one-stop shop for all things skin, hair, and beauty. I have countless blog posts to educate you on all the skin concerns and most common skin questions I receive. We also have a complete skincare basics guide on our shop page, as well as the cutest In My Skin era crew necks. If you want to support the show, please head over to skinthusiast.com/shop. And don't forget to rate and review the show wherever you listen to podcasts. Okay, I want to get back to some of the common skincare myths that we see on social media. And one that this is perpetuated all the time, even amongst skincare experts, and that is that mineral sunscreens are safer for melasma because they reflect light, and therefore they're not absorbing it, creating as much heat as chemical sunscreens. And we know that heat can exacerbate melasma, so we can see where someone might make that connection. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so the idea that mineral sunscreens work by reflecting UV and chemical sunscreens work by absorbing UV and converting it to heat, this is a really long-standing myth. And it's everywhere. Like, it's in so many official sources. It used to be on the AAD website. They recently changed it. It's in the peer-reviewed literature. It's in textbooks, like official dermatology textbooks. It is so pervasive. But part of this is because chemists knew that mineral sunscreens worked by absorbing UV for a really long time. There are lots of papers on people who specifically study, these are semiconductors, so it's all in like semiconductor literature. But a lot of the time, if someone is searching for sunscreen, they're not looking up semiconductor. Like, no one knows to look up that keyword. No. So it's just like, there's a lot of fields in science like this where it's just like disconnected. So in 2016, there was a chemist who used to be at Johnson & Johnson. He got annoyed enough that he specifically did some studies on sunscreen ingredients. He's called Curtis Cole. And that helped a lot. That was one of the first papers I came across that had this so explicitly. But it wasn't quite enough to shift like the conversation, I guess. So I don't know. I complained about it a lot on social media. I think that helped. And then
yes.
Late last
That's where
year,
I first heard about it, was through you.
I think I first heard about it from Stephen. Yeah, so it got around. And then late last year, I published a paper with some dermatologists, including the founder of Fig One, who is Courtney Rubin. So she actually approached me to write this paper, and we published it. And then finally the AAD updated their website. So hopefully that will help this myth settle down. Now with the heat part, a lot of people still wonder, like, will that 5 or 10% of heat that, 5 to 10% of UV that gets reflected, will that 5% less heat make a difference? So I did a test with my old day job supervisor. He had a thermal camera, and we went into the sun and we put sunscreens on skin, on bits of paper, and checked how much heat was being produced. The amount of heat is pathetically small. And that's because our bodies are so watery. Water is really good for dissipating heat. It's why we run our hand under a cold tap when we get burnt. Like, it gets rid of heat really quickly. So any tiny, tiny amount of heat that gets generated on your skin is like dissipated almost immediately. It won't get very far into your skin. So the chance of it causing melasma is just ridiculously low. If you do find that you feel hot with a chemical sunscreen, chances are what's happening is either a sensitivity to an ingredient, like maybe alcohol is stinging your skin from the sunscreen, or perhaps a photoallergy to a chemical sunscreen.
And if anyone's listening to this and wondering kind of why it matters, why wouldn't you just pick mineral to be on the safe side? There are many skin tones that can't use a mineral sunscreen, and even some of the more cosmetically elegant formulations are difficult for some people to use. And even lighter skin tones, there's just like a little bit of a different feel to mineral sunscreens. And if that's going to be enough to keep you from using it, you need to know that it's safe and effective to use the chemical options. Even more effective, some people say. Do you feel that chemical sunscreens are inherently more effective than mineral?
I guess it really depends on the formula. So at the end of the day, the thing that tells you how effective a sunscreen is the SPF, like the tested, measured things. SPF, whether or not it's broad spectrum, if there's a UVA rating. So if you have an SPF 50 chemical sunscreen versus a mineral sunscreen, you should get comparable protection with them, assuming you put on enough, which is what you said. A lot of the time, that texture and white cast, that stops people from putting on enough, and that is not going to work as well. But if we look at like the very top end of sunscreens, if we look at like the SPF 100, the ones that are designed for people who have had skin cancer, for example, they're like SPF, 100, over 100. Those ones always have chemical filters. Zinc oxide is kind of trash as a sunscreen ingredient. It's just not good at absorbing UV for the amount you put in. Titanium dioxide is okay, but there are no titanium dioxide only sunscreens as far as I know, because it doesn't give UVA protection.
Right. And speaking of sunscreens, what do you feel is the most efficacious way to reapply our sunscreen?
That is
if it's someone who needs
really
to reapply.
good question. That is such a good question, and it's one that I have been like losing sleep over for many years. So I guess first off, whether or not you need to reapply, your sunscreen doesn't just suddenly stop working at 2 hours. A lot of people assume that, 2 hours is over, I need to reapply. That's not really the case. It's how much sunscreen is left on your face. A lot of the time you're wiping it off. Sometimes you're sweating and you've got water evaporating from your skin, and that breaks up the layer. So it's sort of like paint. If you've got an intact layer of paint on your skin, then you are protected, but it's cracking over time. So generally for reapplication, the way I think is best to approach it is to think about how much sun exposure you're about to get. So if you're about to get a whole bunch of sun, you've been in the office all day and you're about to go to the beach, then you want a really good layer of sunscreen. And in that case, I would recommend literally doing a proper reapplication. Maybe take off your makeup, put on your full quarter teaspoon onto your face, put it on your body as well, and then go into the sun. Now, if your exposure is a bit less, so you're about to go on like a relatively shady walk, for example, and you still want to reapply, then you have a few more options. And looking at the options, so I've done a few experiments over the years. I have a few videos on this. So powders are terrible. Powders, so sunscreen, the amount of protection you get is always, you need about a quarter teaspoon on your face to get the full labeled protection. So that's the reapplication you're aiming for. Powders, they just simply do not stick to your skin enough. If you look at what happens in the official SPF test, they have like literally a thick layer of powder. The person is lying down, like their skin is not moving. You've got like just caked on. No one can keep that on their face when you're like standing up. So that's just not going to be very good. And even Color Science, they did their own studies trying to show that it worked, and their studies were not convincing. They showed that it didn't work very well. Now, on the next least effective, I guess, is sunscreen sprays. I thought sunscreen sprays would work quite well, but I did some experiments a couple months back. I've got a video that went up, I think, about a month back on my experiments. They were a pain in the ass, but it looks like only at best you get a third of the amount that you spray out onto your face. I think most people, the way they spray, like with like doing X's
So
and
far
moving
away.
around. Yeah, I think that's probably only getting about 1/5, maybe as low as 1/15 of the amount that comes out of the spray. So a lot of that spray, those droplets, they just float off between the spray and your face. They drop to the ground. They're just not going to hit your face unless you are spraying into your hand and then putting it on your face, which in that case, if you like it, that's good, but that's not going to not mess up your makeup, which is the main advantage. Then there's also sticks. Sticks aren't too bad. The problem is you have to put on a lot more than you think. So there's a common recommendation, which is you need 4 swipes. I did some tests, and with the nice sunscreen sticks, the ones that are coming out of Korea, for example, you probably need closer to like 30 swipes to get the label protection.
Wow, 30.
Yeah, that's so much.
Yes. And we're talking one area. So that's 30 swipes along the same direction and then 30 swipes here, right?
Yeah, so overall, I think it took me about 3 minutes of having the stick touching my skin to get to 34 passes, and that is way longer than you would think. Yeah, so I think the advantage of that is that it is like a continuous film compared to a spray, which is in little drops. But you do need a lot of passes. You need more than you think. And the big disadvantage of a stick is that there's nothing that's going to evaporate from the stick after you've applied it to your skin. With most products, you've got alcohol or you've got water that leaves, and then you've got a thinner layer. With a stick, what you put on is pretty much what you get left on your skin. So you have a full 1/4 teaspoon of stuff on your face, whereas with a regular sunscreen, it's probably like 70% water at least. So you've got like a third of that 1/4 teaspoon left as a film on your face. So the best way of reapplying over makeup, I think, is just squeezing out about a 1/4 teaspoon on the back of your hand and then patting it on, possibly with a makeup sponge. But yeah, most of the time, if you want a proper reapplication, you're going to have to mess up your makeup. It's just not really something you can get around.
Yes, I agree completely. So one of the first videos that kind of brought me to your page years ago was how you explained micellar water. I'm sure that's a similar experience for a lot of people. I think that video went like super viral and I still reference it today. I have a question about micellar water in general. A myth that we commonly hear: must you wash it off your face? Like, is it going to cause irritation if you leave it on your face? I especially have patients who, they're campers or they like to go on road trips, things like that, and it's not always feasible for them to actually wash their face, and they'll bring micellar water as a cleanse. Are we going to experience any irritation or issues by not washing it off?
It really depends on the product and your skin. So there are some micellar waters that are specifically designed for sensitive skin. So Bioderma, they specifically designed theirs and they tested it for skin that couldn't handle the hard water in tap water in a lot of places in France. So with Bioderma, most people don't need to wash it off their face. I can't really say that's the case for every product on the market. There are some that I've heard are quite irritating and most people do break out if they don't wash it off. But a lot of them will also be designed to be left on the skin. I don't know what extent of testing they've done, but in theory, some of them definitely will. So I think it's a case-by-case basis. So if you think it's breaking you out, see what happens if you wash it off. If you are camping, maybe splash some water onto a towel and wipe your face afterwards.
Those are great tips. And overall, I love micellar water. I think especially for people who can't stand the feeling of like a balm or oil cleanser as a first cleanse, I think it's such a fantastic option. And for me personally, I'm acne prone, but I kind of go through waves. And if it's a particular period where I feel like I'm getting 1 or 2 pimples and it's not normal for me, I'll switch from a balm or oil to a micellar water just because I feel like the cleanse is so nice, and then go in with my water-based cleanser. And I think those two together just give like the best makeup removal, at least for me. So I really enjoy micellar waters. Next myth: the EU bans more ingredients than here in the United States. So is it right to assume that the FDA isn't as strict and that our products aren't as safe as those that you can get in Europe?
So first off, the number of ingredients that are banned is not really a good indication of whether or not a country has safe cosmetics. Basically, those lists are examples. They are things that are strictly banned, but there is an overarching law that products need to be safe before they're launched on the market. So even though the FDA only has about 11 ingredients on their list, I think, they've actually taken action on products with ingredients that aren't on that list of 11. So for example, there were a lot of lash growth products that contained ingredients that were similar to what's in drugs like Latisse. And so they've actually sent out warning letters based on that. Those ingredients are not on that list of 11. So it's not everything. It's not like the only things that are banned. So in the two regions, that is that overarching principle, things need to be safe. And if you look at the actual products on the market, they are extremely similar. There are like tiny differences. So sometimes one thing will be allowed at 5%, in the other country will be allowed at 8%. Sometimes some things are banned, but they weren't very commonly used anyway. So yeah, overall, the products on the market in both regions are very safe. I would say they are probably two of the safest regions in the world. And if you actually look at a lot of the ingredients that a lot of clean beauty apps and brands demonize, a lot of them are actually in European products. So for example, talc, a lot of people talk about talc and how bad it is because of like the Johnson & Johnson powder, things like that. The science behind that is not super convincing for any links to cancer. But because of the like bad publicity in the US, talcum powder was switched to cornstarch ages ago. But if you go to Europe, talcum powder is everywhere. Like Johnson & Johnson's powder is still talc. Or maybe it's changed very recently, but it was like still talc for a good 5-10 years after it switched in the US. So yeah, there's not really like one region is safer than the other. It's just a lot of it is cultural. Like a lot of the differences you do see in products, otherwise they are very, very similar.
Yeah, I think I recently spoke with Ron Robinson. He was saying, many of the decisions that he has to make for his brand and formulation really come from pressure from the consumer, not necessarily. So his point is, if he's leaving out an ingredient, it's usually because the consumer is kind of demanding it, not because he believes it necessarily needs to be left out. So very interesting. I think sometimes, especially in the clean, quote unquote, clean beauty movement, we see, oh, well, now brands are no longer using this ingredient, so we must have been right about it. It must not be safe. And similarly, when we see lawsuits and things happen with ingredients, we automatically think in our brains, oh, it's not safe. But we know, anytime you can sue somebody for anything, so it doesn't necessarily mean that the science backs it up. Okay, so this is another myth kind of along the same wavelength. Should we avoid apps like the EWG or Yuka, I'm not sure how you say that one, when shopping for products? Or, we see people with their phones out at the store and they're looking for their detergents and their face cleansers on this app to see what score it is, about how potentially like carcinogenic it is and toxic. What are your thoughts on these apps? Are they helpful?
I think you know my thoughts.
I do. I just want to hear you say it.
Yeah, they are not accurate. They are inaccurate and they're really fear-mongering, and they make you stop using products that were fine. And a lot of the time they make you buy more expensive products that do not work better and are not safer. So these apps are not based off good science. The way, like the science of how to work out if something was safe or not is called toxicology. And a really fundamental principle, like literally in the first couple pages of any toxicology textbook, is that safety depends on dose. Like how much you get, the percentage of the ingredient in the product, how much you're applying. It also depends on how it interacts with other ingredients. So some ingredients like skin penetration enhancers, they can get things into your skin more easily. Other ones will keep those ingredients out. So all of this detail is not the case with these apps. These apps literally just scan the ingredient list, and based on the ingredient list, they rate every ingredient with a rating and then jam all of those together to give out a score. Those ingredient lists do not have information on the dose. They don't tell you the exact percentage of every ingredient, so they cannot possibly assess whether something is safe or not. If you have a reputable brand, they will have had a proper toxicologist who knows the entire formula assess it before it's put out onto the market. There's also the fact that if you look through the EWG and the Yuka app, they cite a lot of, quote, scientific sources. But if you look at the sources, a lot of the time they aren't scientific. Like Yuka cites the EWG a lot of the time. And then the EWG, they cite sources that look good. And a lot of the time they are good sources, but then they don't interpret them correctly. Like you'll see that they say, I don't know, something usually a chemical sunscreen, is an endocrine disruptor. They'll cite a source, and if you look at the source, it will say it is not an endocrine disruptor. So there's lots of stuff like that. And then, yeah, so it's really inaccurate. And at the end of the day, killing customers is not good business practice. That is why all these giant brands, they hire toxicologists. They have several full-time toxicologists on staff. You can look them up on LinkedIn. They exist. If you could do that with an app, like if we assume that companies are evil, they just want money, they don't care about our health, they would have fired their toxicologists. They would be using these apps because they are free. Like, the reason they hire these toxicologists is because it just makes commercial sense to make sure your products are safe.
Okay, switching gears a little bit to some more fun questions, not so heavy. This is one that I selfishly want to know what the data says on is how long should we allow our active cleansers to sit on the skin? So I know this is going to maybe vary by ingredient, but let's say a benzoyl peroxide cleanser for acne. You know, we all hear the rule of thumb, like leave it on for 60 seconds before you rinse it off. Does the data actually support that recommendation?
It really depends on the formula. Like, there's so many variables that go into a cleanser. Like, there's the formula, there's how much you use, there's like even how much water you mix with the cleanser before you use it. And that varies so much depending on the person. So a lot of the time, this depends so much on the formula. There are some formulas which hold the ingredient in a coacivate, and that is like a special structure where once you dilute it, then the benzoyl peroxide comes out of like the soap and sticks to your skin. So for a formula like that, that is not going to help if you just leave it for 60 seconds because it's all still stuck in the soap until you dilute it with water and rinse it off. So yeah, it depends so much on the formula. It's really hard to say based, like, even in general for a single ingredient. So I think the easiest thing to do is to just check the product label. If it's a brand that does proper testing, then they would have tested it on lots of people and worked out what the best instructions were in general. So yeah, check the label, just follow what's on the label.
That's a great point. And speaking of the label, I recently had a question come in about the open jar symbol, the period after opening symbol on the back of a product, which I'll pop one on screen for people who are watching, but it's basically like a little open jar and it has a number of months on there. What happens if we use our products beyond that? So let's say it's a 12-month moisturizer and we opened it 13 months ago. What is the risk there? What is that label telling us? Is it efficacy? Is it safety? Is it both?
It depends on the product, but most of the time it is just safety. So cosmetics don't have to be effective to be sold. And a lot of the time there are a lot that aren't effective. They just contain the ingredients and hope for the best. So yeah, the jar symbol is really about safety, and it's kind of like a worst case scenario. It's very cautious because most companies don't want to get sued. They don't want to take that risk. So yeah, generally it's how long they can pretty much ensure that the product is safe for you to use. Most of this is just microbial. So bacteria, fungi, they love to grow when there's water, and most of our products are really watery. They're like really good nutrients for these microbes to grow. If you've ever just it's sort of like food. Like, we know that if we mix food with water and we leave it for too long, we don't put it in the fridge, it's going to start molding. Our products are kind of like this, except they also have preservatives which stop them from molding for a particular period of time. But then the preservatives start to break down. If you've opened the container, then you're also letting in air a lot of the time. And spores and bacteria, they travel on air. They can land in your product and start growing. So that is the biggest risk. With some products, there's also the risk that they stop working. So in particular, I'm talking about sunscreens and also anything that's regulated as a drug. So those ones are tested for efficacy after whatever period of time. So for sunscreens, usually it's about a year. Then you need to chuck it out because the sunscreen ingredients, they can break down, they can start settling, and your product just won't work as well. For sunscreens especially, a lot of us will just take our sunscreen to the beach and we leave it sitting in the sun. That's also not good for the stability of the product, as well as the sunscreen ingredients not working. Your sunscreen will start to separate. So sometimes you'll see it squirting out a bit of oil before it squirts out the actual cream. That's a really bad sign. Most of the time, it is best to only use sunscreen for one season, regardless of what the period after opening is, because you aren't keeping it under optimal conditions. That jar symbol is for pretty optimal conditions, like reasonable conditions, like sitting in your bathroom. It's not for if you've left it in your car for months, if it's been frozen, that kind of thing.
And you mentioned kind of product separation. Is it safe to assume, even in products that are not sunscreen products, that if we see that sort of separation in a product that's not meant to be, you know, there's like these biphase products now, but in a product that's not meant to be separated, if we see that separation, is it safe to assume that we should move on and get something new? Or do you think there's still use for some of those?
I personally am quite risky. Like I will eat food after it's expired. Like I do a sniff test. So yeah, it really depends on your skin. If your skin is quite sensitive, then you probably want to avoid it. I would personally use it on the bits of my skin that aren't as sensitive. Like if it's like a body lotion or something, I will use it on my legs. But if I see something that looks like it's microbial, so if you see like a spot that's changed color, or if you see like something furry, or if it's changed texture massively, or if it's like a weird smell, then I will dump it. But yeah, it's really how risky you are willing to be. Best practice is to chuck it out, but I think a lot of the time, for most people, it is probably okay to use it at least on your feet.
Okay, good to know. So I have your book here, The Science of Beauty, and I know that you're not here necessarily to promote it, but I cannot get through this podcast without mentioning it because it is by far the best skincare book that I've ever read. And not just skincare, you talk about hair care, you talk about beauty. And I don't want to give too much away, but I wanted to ask you about a couple of topics in here that I thought were particularly interesting. The first one being, how might we want to or need to adjust our skincare based on our cycle as women? There's this whole like cycle syncing movement, and I saw a little passage in here about how our cycle can change our skin. So I wanted to know your thoughts. Is this something you practice, or is it just kind of like maybe watch out for this?
It's more of a maybe watch out for this because so many of us, like our skin is influenced by a cycle, and then so many people are not. And the way that your cycle influences your skin is so variable. So in certain parts of your cycle, like towards ovulation, your skin tends to get more moisturized, like it tends to look better, you tend to glow more. And then about just before your period, usually that's when your skin becomes more sensitive. It starts, lots of different skin conditions might start flaring. I think there's like rosacea. A lot of us obviously get breakouts in particular parts of our cycle. So I think it's more a question of what is actually happening with your specific skin rather than any sort of blanket rule. Because yeah, some people, they get breakouts at the start of their cycle. Some people get them at the end. It really depends on, like, there's so many different reasons for breakouts apart from hormones. So yeah, I don't think there's any blanket rules, but I think it is good to maybe keep track of what's happening with your skin and keep track of what products are best for what part of your cycle.
I think it's a good reminder to listen to our skin, and if we notice that our skin tends to be more dry at certain times of the month, kind of lean into nourishing it in ways that maybe we don't need to, you know, other times of the month. But it all comes down to kind of listening to what your skin's telling you a lot of the time. Next one, I love this one. Does drinking water hydrate your skin?
Generally, no. So if you think about what happens to water after you drink it, your skin is like the last place where it goes. So most of the time, there are a few things, like if you're super dehydrated, there is like a pinch test that they'll do at the hospital to check if you're like literally dying of thirst. But other than that, generally, it's not going to make a huge difference. Some people do see a difference. You do get slightly more moisturized. And some people do see like things like their acne clearing. But I think most of that is because they've replaced something else with water. So check for that. But yeah, generally, no. Generally, a moisturizer is going to get to your skin much more effectively than trying to do it from the inside.
I always have patients who feel like they have to say when they're in the office, like, I promise I drink tons of water. My skin is just so dry. And I'm always like, don't worry. It has nothing to do with that. It's a completely separate issue. So they always feel like they feel guilty. Like they have to preface the visit by saying that they drink plenty of water, which I think is funny. Next question from the book. How do we get the most from our dandruff shampoos?
With anti-dandruff shampoos, it really depends on the product again. So check what the instructions say. But a lot of the time, if it is a product that doesn't say to leave it on your scalp for a particular period of time, we'll actually get a better result if you rinse it out and then try it again, because again, it is those coactivates. So products like Head and Shoulders, they work with coactivate technology. That means that the product the active ingredients don't deposit on your scalp until you rinse it with water. So leaving it on there forever versus leaving it on there for like, I don't know, 20 seconds, that's not going to make a huge difference. The other thing, I guess, is also make sure you get it down onto your scalp. I think a lot of people, when they wash their hair, they're like just half-assing it, really. You want to really work it and get it to touch your scalp. Otherwise, I mean, it's just going to deposit mostly on your hair rather than your scalp.
Those are great tips. When I read kind of double shampooing with it, that's a tip I'm definitely going to use in clinic because, you know, it's a very difficult issue and people are always looking for ways that they can maximize their dandruff shampoo, especially if they've only been using it for a couple weeks and they don't see a huge difference. So that's definitely a tip that I'm going to take. So I have a few wrap-up questions. It's so funny because a lot of times with guests, I'm like looking at the clock thinking like, oh, I hope I have enough questions to like get us through the hour. And with you, I'm like, I have so many more questions I could ask, but I want to be respectful of your time. So I'm going to have just a couple wrap-up questions. The first one being, what is your holy grail skincare product?
Oh, this one, I don't know if this is a short
so
question. So I guess the product that is like my ride or die, I've been using it for like 14 years, I think, is Paula's Choice 2% BHA liquid. I will get so angry if they change it. It just works really well on my skin. It's like the thing that keeps all my blackheads at bay. Yeah. Tretinoin, I kind of feel like I have to say that, even though I have a love-hate relationship with it. So my skin is very sensitive to tretinoin. It's the case for a lot of people who are East Asian background. My skin just peels. Like 2 days after I put it on, my skin peels. And so I have to time when I use my tretinoin really carefully to make sure no one is going to be looking at my face as I fall apart. But it does work really well. I have seen the benefits over time. So I guess another product is like just retinol, like old school retinol from a brand that knows what they're doing. So I think I would say the most reliable brands are probably Neutrogena and ROC or ROC. I don't know what you're meant to say. But yeah, they know how to stabilize the retinol and get it into your skin. They've got so much research. They did a lot of the original research behind tretinoin. And so they've used that technology in their retinol. They're really good. I know a lot of people, I keep getting these comments when I talk about drugstore skincare that, oh, it's so mid. Why are you promoting this mid product? It's like, they're really not. They have so many scientists working on their products compared to like brands that seem more sciencey. Like they've got teams of scientists. They publish original research. They're not mid. They're actually so good. And it's so good that they're affordable. Anyway, another one that I really like is the Olay Super Serum, which is, I don't know, I haven't really tried that many Olay products, but that one really impressed me. It's just a really good all-rounder product. It just doesn't break me out. It's just really good for resetting my skin and getting it to glow. And I feel bad saying this one, but the Sulwhasoo Renewing Cream, it's so expensive, but it's so nice.
That's okay. You gave us a lot of budget options. You can have one pricier one in there. It's so funny too with the drugstore skincare. I think a lot of people don't realize that these are often the companies like at the conferences really educating us on what's coming down the pipeline. Exactly as you mentioned, people put the higher end brands that have the nice fancy packaging. They think that somehow their science is maybe better, but in reality, usually a lot of the newer ingredients come from these big drugstore brands first and then trickle down everywhere else. So interesting. Okay, next question. What is your most underrated skincare tip?
I think it's what you said, like listen to your skin. I think a lot of people need to learn to listen to their skin because it's so easy to get swept up in like skincare tips and advice and just like throw everything at your skin, and then you end up with like a 20-step skincare routine and 19 of those products aren't doing anything. You start breaking out and it's like 2 of the products interacting. So I think, yeah, just listen to your skin, go slowly. Don't get overexcited. I know how easy it is because I get overexcited all the time, but try not to. Try one product at a time so you can see what's actually working, what it's actually doing to your skin. And yeah, just learn what your skin likes. Don't feel like you need a solid, consistent routine. You can just look at what your skin condition is like on that particular day if you need particular products. And yeah, that will really cut down on things like irritation.
Yeah, that's a really great tip. And very last question. If you could tell your younger self one thing, what would it be?
I was thinking about this yesterday actually, and I realized like the thing I'm most annoyed at myself about is actually just like not writing stuff down. I've done so much research on topics and then I have to re-research because I can't remember where I wrote that down. And I guess part of that is also like, I have ADHD I feel like most content creators have it. That's why we ended up being content creators. But yeah, just, accept it, get diagnosed, accept it, look up all the tips. They will be so helpful. And one of the tips is writing down your stuff because you will not remember that, Michelle. You will not remember that. Don't kid yourself.
That is probably the most tangible tip I've received when asking that question. So that's something I'm going to take. My husband has ADHD. I'm going to tell him to do it. As you said that, I was just remembering how many times I have to re-research a topic when I'm going to post about it. And I'm like, I know this information. And a lot of times it's me just like, I just want to triple check myself before I put it out into the world. But had I just written it down the first time I researched it, it would have saved me all this trouble. Dr. Michelle Wong, thank you so much for coming on the show. We're going to leave the link to your book below because it's truly the best that I've seen when it comes to skincare, and I really enjoy it.
So
not
lovely
just
to
for
hear.
people, I think it's helpful not just for people who love skincare, but also people who are in the professional space like I am. I learned so much from it. And we'll link all your socials below so everyone can find you because they're like I mentioned earlier, I'm constantly checking myself on your content and sending people to your content just because it is so robust and there's so much information there. So thank you for taking the time. I really enjoyed this conversation and I know the audience is going to too.
Thank you so much. It was an absolute pleasure.
And now you see why I just had to have Dr. Wong on the show. She is such a wealth of knowledge in the cosmetic science space, and I truly appreciate, commend, and respect her dedication to evidence. Her new book, The Science of Beauty, is out now, and it's packed full of skin, hair, and beauty science tips. I'll leave a link in the show notes so you can grab your own copy, and also links to her socials so you can find her and reference her content in the same way I do. If you're just a skin enthusiast, or even if you're a professional in the skin or dermatology space, her content truly is life-changing. It is so evidence-based, so informational, and you can always get the answer that you're looking for. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it to your stories and tag us. I'll be picking a few winners to send a little box of Skin Enthusiast goodies as a thank you. And as always, I will talk to you next week, Skin Enthusiasts.